So this question gives us an equation here and asks us to find the two solutions to this equation. So first of all, this is what's known as a quadratic equation. And what makes it a quadratic equation is the exponent of 2 on the variable here. That's how you can tell this is a quadratic. So the way you want to solve a quadratic equation is first by factoring this equation. Now, I'm going to show you two ways to do that. Um, and I guess you can choose which one you're more comfortable with. Hopefully, you've seen both of these methods before. So let's get started. And first of all, the standard form of a quadratic equation looks like this. It's ax squared plus bx plus c. And then if you're going to factor it, you want to set it equal to 0. Or if you want to solve it, I mean. So if you want to solve it, you want it equal to 0. So you can see that ours is not quite in that form. We just need to move the negative 14 to the other side. And so all we're simply going to do is just add 14 on both sides of the equation, and that'll move the 14 over to the other side. And so then what we end up with is x squared minus 15x plus 14 equals 0. So now we've got it in the standard form. Okay, so the first method I'm going to show you for factoring, what you want to do is you want to find two numbers that multiply to positive 14, but when you add or subtract them, they come out to negative 15. So they need to be about 15 away from each other. So if you think about numbers that multiply to 14, so we've got 7 times 2, but if you add those together, you don't get 15. Since this is a positive 14, it's either 7 times 2, or it could also be negative 7 and negative 2, because both of those come out to 14. Now, since when you add them, it comes out to a negative number, remember it adds to negative 15, that tells me that these two numbers have to both be negative. So to have a multiply to a positive, but add to a negative, they have to both be negative. Multiplying two negatives makes a positive. You add them, you get a negative. So I know they're both negative. 7 and 2 is not the answer. That's not what we want. So what else do we have? 14 and 1. So how about that? Negative 14. Remember, they have to both be negative here. So that multiplies to 14. And if I add those, I get negative 15. So there we go. We found the two numbers. So now what we do with this is we rewrite this as x minus 14. And it's minus because it's a negative 14 times x minus 1, and we set that equal to 0. So this is factoring. So we took the quadratic equation they gave us and we factored it into this. And so now what we're looking for is we're looking for two x values that would make this equation equal to 0. So you can see if x over here was equal to 14, then you'd have 14 minus 14 is 0. And then 0 times anything is 0. So one of the answers is 14. And then you're looking for the x value that would make this 0, which would be 1, 1 minus 1. So my answers are 14 and 1. And so you can see that's answer A. So that's probably the easiest way to do this problem, but I want to show you this other method because in this problem, the coefficient of x squared, so if I look at the x squared here, the number in front of that, the coefficient of that is 1, and we don't write the 1. This method is best to use when that's a 1. But if this isn't a 1, then there are other methods to use that I think are simpler. Now, in my classes, I just teach my students the next method I'm going to show you because it works for everything. So this method works when you have something like this, but the other method works for everything. Although you might think that it takes a little more work. So we'll see. So here's the other method. So I'm going to take my quadratic equation x squared minus 15x plus 14 equals 0. And I'm going to multiply the a and the c terms together. So a is the coefficient of the x squared, which we said was 1, and c is this number here, which is 14. So I'm going to multiply those together. So 1 times 14 is going to give me 14. So this is a times c equals 14. And then I need I need two numbers that when I add them together, these same two numbers, so a plus c, has to equal the b value. So it has to equal this number, which is negative 15. So equals negative 15. So what I did, let me back this up. I took a times c, so 1 times 14, that gave me 14. And then a plus c has to equal the b term. And so I'm trying to find these two numbers, a and c, that when I multiply them, I get 14, and when I add them, I get negative 15. So kind of similar to what we did here, all right, on the same path. Um, Again, the product is positive, but the sum is negative, so that means they're both negative. So I go back to this. And so we already figured out the two numbers are negative 14 and negative 1. So I can split. What I'm going to do is take this negative 15x and I'm going to split it up like this. So I have the x squared and then the negative 15x I'm going to split into minus 14x minus 1x, and then the plus 14 equals 0. All right. So all I did was take the negative 15 and split it into negative 14x minus 1x because that's equivalent. And now, so this method, I can't remember if I told you, this is called grouping. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to break this into two groups like this. And we're going to factor these two groups if we can. So in the first group, I have a greatest common factor of x. So I'm going to factor out the x, and that leaves me with x minus 14. And then on the other one, now here's the trick with the grouping method. When I factor this, I need to come up with x minus 14. So right now it's negative x plus 14. So I need to change the signs there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out a negative 1. So I factor that out, and that becomes x minus 14. And now you can see the two groups match each other. So x minus 14 and x minus 14. When you do this grouping method, you want that to happen. So sometimes you got to factor out a negative number in order to change the signs so that they match up. Okay, so now if I look at this expression, I have an x minus 14 that's common to both of these, so I can factor that out. So I'm going to factor out the x minus 14. I'm going to divide it out. And then that would be times the x minus 1. X minus 1. And this is equal to 0. And so you can see I divided out the x minus 14, that was here, and that left me with this x and this minus 1, and I just put those there. And so you can see now we ended up with exactly what we ended up with on the other one. And yes, I will agree that this is more work, but there are some problems where you're gonna have to use this method, okay? So I would suggest that you learn how to use grouping and use it all the time. If you have a really good memory and you can remember both of these, then you're definitely better off using the first method that I did. Now, one last thing I'll point out is that you can always come up with the solutions to a quadratic equation using x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4AC over 2A, which is the quadratic equation. So you probably will have this equation on your reference sheet. And all you do is find the values of A, B, and C. So A is the coefficient of x squared, B is coefficient of x, and then C. So you find those values, you plug them into this, and it will give you the solutions. So that's always an option also. Okay? So if you didn't quite get this, I would really recommend you to back it up and watch it again. Watch it a couple times, okay? Because it's important that you know how to do this. So keep up the good work, keep practicing, and you will master the math.